Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rodney Mills, and I'm joined by my wife, Dr. Sarah Mills, and we're both agents of change in the command. We'd like to welcome you to the 2020 Empowering Tomorrow's Leaders Conference, where this year's theme is to empower, connect, innovate, and deter. And because this is a virtual conference, you too will have the opportunity to be a speaker. So if you have a 5 to 7 minute story you'd like to share, we'd love to hear it. So please contact Dr. Mills to get started. Now, I'm really excited about introducing our very first speaker of the conference. He's a visionary thinker and aware intellect. He's the author of many bestsellers like Start With Why, Leaders Eat Last, Together is Better, and his latest book, The Infinite Game. He's probably best known for popularizing the concept of why, which he described in his first TED Talk, which today at over 50 million views is still in the top 5 TED Talks of all time. He's also well known for his talk on millennials, which has been viewed by millions. Now I could go on and on about Simon, but let's get started. Simon, welcome.
Before we get started, I wanted to lay out some ROEs for this event. This is an unclassified interview, so please keep your questions at the unclassified level. And speaking of questions, if you want to submit your questions via the chat function, we'll take a look at those as well. We've already collected over 50 questions, so we'll do our best to kind of capture the span of questions in the time that we have with Simon. And in the grouping of those questions, they kind of fell into 3 key areas: mission, workplace, and then everyday relationships. So even though it may sound like we're kind of jumping around a bit, we do want to make sure that we capture the wide range of questions being asked. So let's get started. Now, Simon, before we get into the actual submitted questions, for those who haven't had a chance to read the Infinite Game book, please explain why you wrote the book, and then as well as a brief overview of what it means to play in the Infinite Game.
I was introduced to Dr. James Carse's work many years ago. Dr. Carse was a philosopher, and in the mid-1980s, he theorized that there were these 2 kinds of games: finite games and infinite games. A finite game is defined as known players, fixed rules, and agreed upon objectives. Baseball, football. In a finite game, there's always a beginning, middle, and end. And if there's a winner, there has to be a loser. Then there are infinite games. Infinite games are defined as known and unknown players, which means new players can join at any time. The rules are changeable, which means every player can play however they want. And the objective is to perpetuate the game, to stay in the game as long as possible. And when I started to learn about Dr. Carse's perspective, I realized that we are players in infinite games every day of our lives. There's no such thing as being number 1 in your marriage. You can be number 2, but you can't be number 1. There's no such thing as winning global politics. There's no winner of global politics. It just keeps going and going. There's no such thing as winning education, winning healthcare, and there's definitely no such thing as winning business or winning career. No one's declared the winner of careers. But if we listen to too many leaders, they talk about being number 1, being the best, and beating their competition. Based on what? Based upon what agreed upon objectives, based upon what agreed upon timeframes, based upon what agreed upon metrics. In other words, when we play with a finite mindset in an infinite game, this is what I learned. There's a few bad things that can happen: decline of trust, decline of cooperation, and decline of innovation. And so I started to realize that so many of us are going through life and building our organizations with the wrong mindset for the game we're actually in. And it's causing this damage. It's hurting the culture of the companies, the organizations. It's also hurting the ability to outthink the other players in the game, or even to innovate. And so I started talking about it, just behind closed doors. And it started as a briefing I actually used to give to the IC and to the military, because I thought it was so fascinating and a way of re-understanding the New World Order post the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the more I started talking about it, the more I realized that it has application in more places, and I eventually decided to write a book about it.
Great. So like I said, we do have a bunch of questions that we want to get through with our time with you. The first one I want to ask is in the mission category. In our line of work in the military, it's often asked, what is more important? Is it the mission or the people? How should an infinite-minded leader respond to that question?
Missions come and go, but the people are what make the organization endure. If you go back, 100 years, 50 years, the missions that the uniformed forces are performing are pretty different. but the people endure. And so I understand that it's, you know, that it says, you know, mission first, people always. I believe that it's in the opposite order, that it's people always, you know, people first, mission always, or something to that effect. That we take care of our people first, and that's what that leads to mission success, and it goes in that order. When people are awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, very often the mission was a failure. We don't give the highest medal in the land for mission success. We give it for the willingness to sacrifice to save the lives of others. It's a very people focused. It's a very human award. And everybody knows that it's not the equipment that we drive, it's the people who are driving it that make it effective. So though both are important, there has to be a bias. And it's the same in business. Money is important in business, but there has to be a bias towards people. And there inherently is a bias towards people in the military. So but it would be nice to see the language actually operate the way you actually operate.
Exactly. Okay. So this next question has to do with the workplace. When playing in an infinite game, how do you create an environment where people can operate at their best?
How do you operate in an environment where people can operate at their best? You know, leadership is what creates an environment in which people can operate at their natural best. So when you say, how do you operate at your natural best? It requires leadership. Leadership sets environment. And one of the things that leaders are responsible for doing is creating an environment in which trust can exist. We all know what it feels like to work on a trusting team. It means we can raise our hands and say, I need help, or I don't understand, or I made a mistake, or you promoted me to a position where I no longer understand what I'm doing. I need more training, without any fear of humiliation or retribution. In fact, you say these things with the expectation that your boss or your colleagues will rush in to support. We also all know what it feels like not to work on a trusting team, where you'd never admit a mistake. You'll never say that you don't know what you're doing. You'll never ask for help or admit that you're scared for fear of humiliation or retribution. And we know exactly what happens on those teams. You know, unfortunately, people are forced to protect themselves, often at the sacrifice of the organization. We have to protect ourselves from our leaders sometimes. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the environment is toxic. It just means that the command environment doesn't create a sense of trust that we are willing to sacrifice ourselves for each other in every circumstance. And I'm not talking about in combat. I'm talking about on a daily basis. I'm talking about giving up credit. I'm talking about saying I need help. Being vulnerable at work means I made a mistake. Can somebody help me? That's vulnerable. And so leaders are required to set that tone, to set that environment. If there's somebody who's got rank who's not doing that, then we don't just all sit back on our laurels. Leadership has nothing to do with rank. Authority comes from rank. I know many people who sit at the highest levels of organizations who are not leaders. We do as they tell us because they have authority over us, but we would never follow them. Yet I know many people who have no formal rank. They have no particular authority, and yet they've made the choice to look after the people to the left of them, the choice to look after the people to the right of them, and we would trust them and follow them anywhere. So every one of us has the opportunity to be the leader we wish we had and create an environment in which the people we work with want to come to work and feel supported.
Yeah, so that's I like that concept, because it's like it's not you're not pointing the finger at a particular person saying, hey, it's not happening because of you. You're basically saying we all could play a part in it and be that leader.
Yeah, I mean, this is Viktor Frankl stuff, right? Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, which is, I consider, essential reading for human beings, said that we cannot control the circumstances. All we can control is our attitude. And if we can't change the circumstances, we can change ourselves. So if we're sometimes subjected to substandard leadership, then it's an opportunity for us to step up and lead.
Yeah, okay. So when it comes to leaders, how important is the leader's priorities when it comes to leading an infinite-minded organization?
So there's no such thing as a purely infinite-minded organization, of course, just like there's no such thing as a purely finite-minded organization. But the problem is that leaders of organizations don't always know the game they're in. So they over-index on finite strategies when they're playing in the infinite game. And so you have to ask yourself, what game are we in? It's the difference between, there are always finite games inside the infinite game. There are battles of which there is a beginning, middle, and end, and there is a winner and there is a loser. And we know what the metrics are and we know what the timeframes are. But when those battles are completed, that doesn't mean the war is over. There is such thing as infinite war, and Stratcom plays if not the most significant role in that infinite war, which is we never want to go to nuclear war. It's not a game of winning and losing. Like, it's a game that we never want to get into that finite game. And so we play a game where anybody can join. The threats that we face today are very different than the threats that we faced 50 years ago. The players have changed as the tenets of the infinite game would say so, that new players can drop out, old players can drop out, and new players can join, which is exactly what happened. The Soviet Union fell out of the game because they ran out of the will or the resources to play. We did not win. The game was infinite. It never ended. What ended up happening is new players emerged, and new threats emerged. And so we have to change the way we play, but we still want to stay in the game as long as possible. We want to perpetuate this stalemate. That's the goal. And it's a game of ahead and behind. There's no winning or losing. There's just ahead and behind. Sometimes we're ahead and sometimes we're behind. And so we have to conceive of the game we're in before we develop strategies to play in it.
Yeah, and so that kind of ties into one of the stories you brought in your book about how Apple approached Microsoft and IBM, and how they approached Apple. And so I know, like in a lot of military offset strategies, the goal is to offset the enduring advantages of a particular adversary. So along those lines, how would the U.S. approach its adversaries in relation to the way that Apple kind of engaged theirs?
So let me tell the story you're referring to so that people know what we're talking about. So I had an opportunity to speak at an education summit for Apple. I also had an opportunity to speak in an education summit for Microsoft. At the Microsoft summit, every single executive spent all of their time talking about how to beat Apple. At the Apple summit, the executives were talking about how to help teachers teach and how to help students learn. One was obsessed with where they were going. The other one was obsessed with beating their competition. And when we play with a finite mindset in an infinite game, remember, there's no such thing as winning in the game of business. What necessarily happens is the player playing with the finite mindset actually finds themselves in quagmire. In other words, they find themselves racing through the will and resources they need to stay in the game. And that's exactly what was happening to Microsoft at the time. Morale was super low during those days, and Microsoft was not doing so great. When I was done speaking at Microsoft, they gave me a gift. They gave me the new Zune when it was a thing. This was Microsoft's response to the iPod. And this little piece of technology they gave me was really quite fantastic. It was really quite brilliant. It worked well. The user interface was intuitive and easy to use. And at the end of my Apple talk, I was sharing a taxi with a senior Apple executive. And I couldn't help myself. I had to stir the pot. And I turned to him and said, Microsoft gave me their new Zune, and it is so much better than your iPod Touch. And he turned to me and he said, I have no doubt. And the conversation was over. Because when you're playing with an infinite mindset, you understand that sometimes you have the better product and sometimes they have the better product. And the goal is not to win. The goal is to outlast. There's only ahead and behind. So of course, it's imperative for us to study our adversaries, the other players, but not always. It's not always good to be reactive. We've seen this in the business world over and over again. Airbus, Boeing, for example, had basically a monopoly in the commercial airline business for years, 90-something% market share. And then Airbus showed up. And all of a sudden, Boeing was panicking because they were losing market share. Well, who else are you going to lose? Who else is going to lose it? You've got a monopoly. And we've seen this play out over the years, unfortunately, which is the 787 was faced with delay after delay after delay because Boeing had a strategy and they kept worrying about what Airbus was doing. And they kept changing their strategy in reaction to Airbus. And then we saw it with the 737 as well, with the 737 MAX, which is they had a strategy, but instead of sticking to their strategy, they kept reacting to market demands. And they ended up cutting corners and producing an aircraft that wasn't fit to fly. And so when we're reactive and we're willing to so quickly adjust long-term strategy simply to react to short-term pressures, sometimes we can do long-term damage. What I think is a valuable way of looking at the other players in the game is not to see them as competitors to be beaten, but rather as rivals. And some of those rivals are worthy of comparison. You get to choose your own worthy rivals. You can have as many or as few as you like. And the whole point of a worthy rival is to look at their strengths, because their strengths reveal to you your weaknesses. And so if you have a rival that is very, very good at something that we're very, very bad at, it's not just about beating them or undermining them. It's about making the improvements on our side so that we become as good, if not better, at that thing. But it's not specifically to beat them. It's to be better versions for ourselves so that if anything were to happen, we're actually prepared. We're the strongest we could ever be at the time that something would happen. But again, the mentality of an infinite-minded player is constant improvement, constant improvement, constant improvement. And one of the best ways to improve is for our worthy rivals to reveal to us our weaknesses. So absolutely, we should study the other players, and absolutely, we should be honest about where they're good and where we have room to improve. But if it's simply about beating them, that doesn't mean we're necessarily going to improve our systems. We just might undermine theirs. And if that player drops out of the game, we're not prepared for the new player, because we weren't actually making ourselves better. We were just trying to undermine that one player. So we have to be in this mindset of constant improvement.
Yeah, I like that idea. As you were saying that, I was kind of thinking of like a quarterback. If a quarterback was only focusing on one edge defender and not paying attention to the other adversaries, you could kind of, get sacked, right? And so,
well, I think we overuse sports analogies in the infinite game.
Yeah. So what's the balance between, because in our case, we do have to make a case to Congress, and usually when we do that, we talk about the adversary's capabilities. So you're okay with a little bit of comparison?
No. I'm okay with a lot of it.
Okay.
Remember, the infinite game is not the absence of finite games. The infinite game is the context within those finite games that those finite games exist. So, let's go back in history. We could argue that the United States made perhaps one of the biggest foreign policy blunders of the 20th century when the Berlin Wall came down and we announced that we had won the Cold War. No, we didn't. There was no such thing as winning in this game. There was no treaty signed. There was no agreement as to what winning would even look like. Nobody predicted that would even happen. We didn't know what the objective of that would look like. Winning was staying alive. We didn't win the Cold War. The player dropped out of the game because they ran out of the will or the resources to play. And the problem was we acted like victors. We imposed our will on the rest of the world for about 11 years. And it turns out the rest of the world didn't like that. And so as what always happens in an infinite game is new players emerged. The Soviet Union existed on three tensions, right? There was a nuclear tension, which is your job. There was an ideological tension. The United States and the Soviet Union were both ideological exporters looking for customers. The Soviet Union exporting communism, and the United States exporting democracy and capitalism. Both looking for customers and allies and trading partners. And of course, there's also the economic. Both competed economically, and the United States and the Soviet Union were the first and the second largest economies in the world, which fueled their global ambitions. Those three tensions, not coincidentally, align perfectly with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the only three things for which we'll bear any burden and pay any price, because they're existential for us, right? Mm-hmm. And so, though the Soviet Union went away, those three tensions were replaced by other players. The nuclear tension, Soviet Union was replaced by North Korea, maybe Pakistan, maybe Iran, right? Or non-state actors. The ideological tension, Soviet-style communism, was replaced by religious extremism. And the economic tension was replaced by China. In other words, this Cold War is alive and well, but it's taken on a completely different form because the players are completely different, which means we have to completely adjust the way in which we play the game because all the players are different. And by the way, every single one of those players will drop out of the game eventually for whatever reason, and new players will emerge. So we have to just be aware of the infinite game that we're in, which is alive and well, but the current form of it is different. And so of course we have to play for the form we're in, but we have to be aware of the fact that we have to play forever. We actually have to play beyond these players. And so again, the infinite game is not the absence of finite games. Of course, we want to meet the immediate threats that we're facing. At the same time, constantly strengthening our organization for everything that we cannot predict. We're now living in a global pandemic. We're having this over a Zoom call because we can't meet in person. Like, people were sounding alarm bells for this for years, but it sounded like science fiction. And so we say things now like, boy, nobody expected this. Well, welcome to the infinite game. That's exactly what we're preparing for. That's what the whole point of the infinite game is, which is constant improvement. So when the unexpected happens, we're probably more prepared than we would have been if we were only playing the finite game.
Yeah, so it's that whole concept of not trying to be the best, but continually getting better, because you don't know when the field's going to change, when the players are going to change, and so forth.
Right, exactly. And like I said, we overuse sports analogies, right? Because sports analogies are always about winning and losing. There's beginning, middle, and end, and the game ends. So you have to understand, in a finite game, at the end of the game, in the finite game, it's the game that ends. You know, the Yankees will play the Red Sox, and at the end of the game ends, but the Yankees and the Red Sox continue to exist. It's the game that ends. In the infinite game, it's the players that end, right? The game of global politics has continued regardless of whether the Ottoman Empire or the Roman Empire exist or not. The game of global politics continues with or without the players. It's the players that disappear, but the game perpetuates. Mm-hmm. So the game will continue with or without the United States. That's why we say, to play in the game, we want to stay in the game as long as possible. We're trying to perpetuate the game.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think COVID-19 kind of did that for really everybody, where it was kind of introduced as kind of a quote unquote new player, and then the new playing field for a lot of people was telework, right? And then the different roles with stay-at-home orders. So like, how do you function in a world where you have this new player, you've got to operate in a telework environment, and you have all these stay-at-home orders preventing you from even doing things that you think you could have done. So can you explain a little?
And think about all the things that revealed in the military. Like,
mm-hmm.
like the business world was like, all right, we'll just turn on Zoom and we're fine.
Yeah.
Right? The military was like, well, we're not allowed to use Zoom. Well, why not?
Yeah, exactly.
Because we didn't buy it from some, contractor or something,
Yeah.
And like, it's revealed a huge amount of opportunity for growth and improvement.
Mm-hmm.
That gives new skills and capabilities to the military if we can fill those gaps. And it's wonderful, because it's revealed all these opportunities of where improvements can be made, and opportunities to use commercial and off-the-shelf technologies that are really good, that gives the military entirely new capabilities. Obviously, in different, only in an unclassed, way. But the point is it works. So I think it's an amazing opportunity for additional learning and additional capabilities.
Mm-hmm. Now, kind of along this lines, I noticed during the COVID-19, what we experienced, you had a lot of people just kind of rallying together because there was this common threat of COVID-19, and we wanted to continue doing the mission. But how do you get people to kind of have that rally mentality when the day-to-day doesn't pose an immediate threat?
In general, like in your mission, you mean?
Yeah, just in general. Like normally people, they'll rally around whenever.
When there's a threat, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So this is where short-term metrics are really helpful, and this is why constant improvement is really a great way to keep people motivated, right? I think I'll give you an example. I had the opportunity to visit one of the I forgot what you call them, the capsules, the command bunker things, that launched.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Mm-hmm.
And you have these young airmen there guarding these farmhouses in the middle of nowhere, and you think to yourself, like, no one's going to attack this little thing. It's in the middle of nowhere. If it's an aircraft, we'll catch it before it gets there. If somebody's driving there, we'll catch it before it gets there. And then the opportunity is so low, but you can't not guard it. You have to guard it. So how do you keep these young airmen motivated, right? How do you keep them inspired for a threat that is unlikely to show up, but you have to guard? And I think the opportunity is to make the little wins. It's the little wins in the infinite game. It's actually using the finite game to your advantage. So for example, let's change the analogy away from sports, which is about winning and losing, and let's change away from talking about the threat, which works well when there is an immediate threat, but it doesn't work well when the threat is not immediate or of only a very small chance of happening. So think of it like getting healthy. right? Which is we want to stay healthy to avoid early death. The threat is early death, right? And so the strategy is stay healthy. And we can set finite goals within this infinite game. So for example, I want to lose X amount of weight by X date. That's very motivating. It's very exciting. You weigh yourself every day. You start eating healthy. You start exercising. And if you hit your goal, well, you have to keep exercising and eating healthy for the rest of your life. But if you miss the goal, nothing happens. Nothing happens because the goal was arbitrary, but it's exciting and motivating. And so I think constant improvement is the thing that we can use to keep people motivated when we deal with these existential threats, right? So this is why I love the study of the worthy rival, to find out all the places that we can improve. And then you set everyone the task of constant improvement, constant improvement, constant improvement. And that's what keeps people motivated in the day to day. You know, the threat of some faraway thing, or of like, you know, you're going to die at some point, you know, live as long as you can. It's hard to conceive of because it's so far away or unrealistic. So I think where you can ask any airman, any sailor, any Marine, any soldier, like, what are the improvements that we can make on a day-to-day basis? That's where you set goals, set targets, hold people accountable. And what's ended up happening, whether you hit those goals or don't hit those goals, the point is the organization is getting stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger. And if you go back to my lifestyle analogy, even if I miss my goal and I don't lose the weight, I'm still healthier now than I was before I started. And that's the point. It's the constant improvement. And it's the finite game can help keep us focused. The finite game tends to be close at hand. And so the question you're asking is, you know, how do you stay motivated in the infinite game? You use elements of the finite game, but within the context of the infinite. So facing immediate threats, there's nothing wrong with that, as long as you understand the context and that it lasts beyond those threats.
Okay, for those of you that are just joining us, we're joined by best-selling author Simon Sinek, and we're talking about his book, The Infinite Game. As a reminder, this is an unclassified interview. I think we have a few questions in the chat, so Sarah, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Rodney. We have 3 questions that came in. Simon, when in your life have you been so passionately focused on an activity that you lost track of time and what you were doing?
I mean, it happens. I mean, doing Lego can get me completely losing track of time. You know, I find that, you know, we all, when we're doing, it goes into this idea of passion. You know, when you're so passionately focused, you know, what is passion? And I think passion is an output, not an input. So, you know, I love talking to leaders and they say, we only hire passionate people. Well, how do you know that they're passionate for interviewing, not so passionate for working? You know, everybody's passionate. We're not all passionate for the same things. What makes our passion come out is when we're engaged in something that we believe in or we enjoy, and then our passion pours out of us. You know, I can do something that I'm supposed to be passionate. I can't manufacture passion. You know, I can't give you an impassioned speech about the migration patterns of European swallows because I don't care. You know, I'm passionate about the things that I care about. So I tend to lose track of time when I'm enjoying myself, when I'm engaged in something, like anybody. Quite frankly, this kind of stuff, I lose track of time. You know, I'm waxing philosophical about some of these things that I adore, and before you know it, an hour has passed. And Lego does that to me as well.
So you want to do the other 2 questions?
I would love to. Simon, how does the US use the infinite game mentality to succeed in the world economics game?
So again, the thing to recognize is no such thing as winning global politics. There's no such thing as winning global economics, right? It just doesn't exist. We can be ahead and we can be behind. That's it. And even when we're ahead, the answer is for now. Like, I love it when organizations come to me and say, we're the best. I'm like, yep, for now. Like, that stuff never lasts. And so how we stay ahead in the infinite game, first of all, what metrics are we counting? You know, is it GDP? Or is it household income? Or is it salary disparity? Or is it healthcare? I mean, how are we, is it education? Like, how are we, is it how we spend our money? Is it how we make our money? Is it how we save our money? Like, if you're going to think about American economics in terms of savings, we're really bad. Like, Americans don't save money. So are we powerful? Maybe. Like, I don't know. It depends on the metric you're looking at. Sometimes we're really powerful on one metric and really weak on another metric. And that's why it's very dangerous to pick arbitrary metrics and say, look, we're number one, because not necessarily. And how we spend our money is just as important as how we make our money. And so in the infinite game of economics, we think to ourselves, okay, how can we make our economy resilient, which is different than stable. Stable means we go into crisis and we come out of it the same way, stability. Resilience means we go into crisis and we come out of it different, better, stronger, right? And I would argue that we have a semi-stable economy, but do we have a resilient economy? Are we actually changing the way in which we do business because of COVID, that when we come out of this, we actually have learned lessons of where we had weaknesses that were revealed to us because of COVID, and now we've built those weaknesses out. We've gotten rid of those weaknesses. We've changed policy to make us stronger should this ever happen again. And that's what the infinite game of economics should look like. Constant improvement at a low level and a high level, micro and macro, that businesses should be making constant improvements and having our weaknesses revealed to us because of how our other nations' economies react and how we react. Again, remember, because there's no such thing as winning, it's, just because one nation does something economically doesn't mean we should immediately pour all of our resources in trying to beat them because we're taking them away from someone else. The question is, how do we make ourselves stronger? How do we make ourselves resilient? How do we last as long as possible? How do we get better and better and better at doing what we do?
Okay. And Sarah, let's go to that third question before we get back to the pre-submitted ones.
Sure. How much power does a single individual have who's not a high-level leader to bring about positive organizational change?
So we are social animals, we're tribal animals. And as individuals, we have no power. As individuals, we're not that smart and we're not that strong. But in groups, we're remarkable. And so what one individual can do is talk about what they believe, is commit themselves to a life of service to the people around them, to take care of the people around them, so that the people around them feel safe enough that they're willing to take care back. And what starts to happen is you build teams. A team is not a group of people who work together. A team is a group of people who trust each other. And then as the team grows, now you start to have influence. And by the way, you don't even have to know the people on your team. I write and talk about my beliefs. I imagine a world in which the vast majority of people wake up every single morning inspired, feel safe wherever they are, and end the day fulfilled by the work that they do. There are people who share that vision of the world with me, and they have embraced it and are building their organizations and leading in a way that helps advance that cause. We are teammates. We are in the same army, though I may not know them and they may not know me. But we're working towards the same vision. What helps is when I'm putting the ideas out that gets people to come together. I'm sharing my vision. So if you have a vision or belief, share it. If you have ways in which a vision or belief can come to life, share it. If there are small steps that you can take in your daily practice, in your daily life, in your job that advance a greater good, do it. So for example, I've had this conversation with the military many times, which is, how does somebody who's a junior person in the military affect big Air Force or big Marine Corps, big Army, big Coast Guard, big Navy? Like, how does one service member do that? Well, it goes back to service, right? So the example I gave was a maintainer, right? And we produce these lines of logic that don't really work. So this young maintainer is working there, turning their wrench, right? And the way we try and motivate them, we say, by you turning that wrench, you're keeping the wings on the aircraft, which allow the pilot to fly their mission, which allow them to drop their ordnance, which allow them to preserve freedom and democracy around the world. So you're preserving freedom and democracy. It's too many steps. The logic chain it's just too long. And so it's really hard to see how every day I'm preserving freedom and democracy. It's too hard. We need to bring it closer. Yes, that's the big context, but now we need to make the context smaller, more human. And I learned this when I visited RAF Mildenhall, and they took a senior maintainer off the line to take care of me and drive me around that day. And one of the things I had the opportunity to do was to fly the KC-135 sim. And I had my fun and I tooled around. And this maintainer had never even been in the sim before, but we brought him in with us and he got to see the sim. And at the end, I had my fun and I turned to the maintainer. I said, do you want to fly? So we put him in the left seat. There was a flight instructor with us, and we let him fly. We let him fly the KC-135. And we said, what's your specialty? He said, electronics. And we said, okay, turn the electronics off. So in mid-flight, we turned the electronics off. And for the first time in his career, he's been in the Air Force 20 years. For the first time in his career, he actually had firsthand experience of what happens when his system fails in the aircraft. It was no longer this abstract chain of logic. So I started going around the Air Force saying, we've got to put maintainers in sims. And people were saying, well, it's too expensive. We don't have the sim time. And I would ask pilots, I would say, would you give up 5 minutes of sim time? Because that's all he had was 5 minutes. Would you give up 5 minutes of sim time at the end of your session to let a maintainer experience what happens when their system fails? And all the pilots said, absolutely, I'd love to do that. I want them to feel that. And all of a sudden, we started to do it, and some places started to do it. And all of a sudden, these maintainers had direct personal contact. They finally knew what would happen, not to the aircraft, not to the mission, but to the person whose name they knew. So they were no longer doing it for freedom and democracy. They were doing it for that person now, right? Or for those pilots. And there's been a lot of research done on this. When people have contact with an individual who is the direct recipient of the work that they do, it has massive positive impact on their performance. So for example, this research was done, I think out of Wharton, where a group of fundraisers at a university, volunteers, would raise money for a scholarship. Hello, I'm raising money for this scholarship. Would you please give? You know the deal. And the numbers were down. So they hired a consulting company to write a new script, right? In these hard times, and that didn't have much effect. So this group of researchers brought in one of the students who was one of the recipients of the scholarship. And they had the student talk to these volunteers for 5 minutes. That was all, 5 minutes, about the value of the scholarship in their lives. All of a sudden, performance dramatically increased with no new scripts, no new anything, because they weren't reading anymore. They are now speaking passionately because they weren't helping some abstract student in these hard abstract times. They were helping that person. And so going back to what I was saying before, what we need to remind every person at every rank is that their responsibility, yes, is to the big, broad mission, but it's also to the person to the left of them and the person to the right of them. And those young maintainers, for example, have 2 jobs every day of their lives. One, to make sure that they are learning enough, learning so much, that the person who takes over their job from them eventually will be better at their job because of them. So keep notes of all the little tricks and hacks that you're learning how to do your job, so that when you're done, you're going to pass that little notebook on to the person who follows you, so they don't have to learn them all from scratch. You're going to teach them, so that, again, this is constant improvement. If every member of the service work to ensure that the person who takes their job will be better at their job than they were, guess what's happening to the organization? Second job is to make sure the person to the left and the person to the right feel supported. You're good? You're good? We're good. That every day you have to check in and make sure that your colleagues and coworkers, that your brothers and sisters feel like you have their back on a daily basis. This is not just a combat philosophy, it's a daily philosophy. And if we do that, then the spreading of freedom and democracy, the big abstract mission, dramatically increases in efficacy, because we're focusing on daily things that we can see and measure every single day.
Yeah, and kind of to expand on that a little bit, I know in your book you talked about high-performing teams and how they value trust and performance. Can you kind of share with the group that concept?
Yeah, it was a conversation that I know what you're talking about. It was a conversation that I had with a SEAL from Dev Group. And I asked a simple question: who gets into Dev Group? And he drew me a chart. He drew on one axis was performance, and on the horizontal axis was trust. And the way that he defined trust and performance was performance is how you operate on the battlefield, and trust is who you are off the battlefield. The way he put it is, I may trust you with my life, but do I trust you with my money or my wife, right? That was trust versus performance. And what he explained is that nobody wants the low performer of low trust in the lower left quadrant, of course. Everybody wants the high performer of high trust, of course. What they learned is that the high performer of low trust is a toxic team member. And that they would rather have a medium performer of high trust, sometimes even a low performer of high trust, it's a relative scale, over a high performer of low trust. And if you think about how most incentive structures work, we measure everybody's performance, but the question is, are we measuring their trust, their trustworthiness? And so sometimes, quite accidentally, we keep promoting these toxic team members into positions of rank and leadership, and now you have toxic leaders because they were motivated by self. Now, they're not necessarily bad people. They may have never been told or never given feedback. The opportunity is not to eject them from the organization. The opportunity is to coach them. Just as somebody who's a low performer, we want to coach their performance up. If somebody has leadership problems or somebody has trust issues, we coach them. We don't know what's going on in their lives. The only time to ask someone to leave the organization is if they prove to be uncoachable. And that goes for performance or for trust. If somebody rejects everything, says, I'm fine, I think I know what I'm doing, if they prove to be uncoachable and believe they have no room to improve, well, then how can we ever play with an infinite mindset, which is entirely about constant improvement as individuals or as an organization, as teams or as an organization? It's constant improvement. And so we all would be willing to take ourselves on. But I thought that was so fascinating how these two axes matter to them. And these are some of the, the SEALs, and all the SEAL teams are some of the highest performing teams on the planet. And yet they value trust over brawn on the battlefield.
Yeah. In your book, you, along the lines of trust and integrity, you mentioned the idea of ethical fading. Can you briefly describe that for the group, and then tell us why it's so detrimental to an organization?
So ethical fading is a psychological phenomenon where people will make highly unethical decisions, believing that they're still within their own ethical framework. So, for example, we've seen this happen in the private sector. When a pharmaceutical company, for example, who has a patent on an essential drug, raises the price of the drug 200, 300, 400, 500, 1,000%. They can. It's not illegal, but it's really unethical, right? Or what we saw happen at Wells Fargo Bank, where we saw employees open 3.5 million fake bank accounts because they were incentivized to hit certain sales targets. And because the targets were so unreasonable and the pressure was so great, the only way that they could hit those targets was by doing these things. Sometimes it was illegal, but not always, but every time it was highly, highly unethical. And we've seen unethical fading happen in the military. There was a paper that was written a few years ago, and it's happened across the board, but the paper the one that I'm citing happened to happen in the Army, where they found ethical fading, they found lying pervasive amongst officers. For example, one of the examples they gave, and by the way, the general population believes that the military holds a position of higher integrity than the general population, and the military agrees. The military generally believe that they hold themselves to higher levels of integrity than the general population. So it was a surprise to everyone to find out that lying was so rampant. So let me give you an example of some of the lies that were happening. A group was preparing to deploy, and they were asked to do some online training in preparation for deployment. And because they were put in a catch-22, that the number of things that they were expected to do for training outnumbered the number of training days that they actually physically had. Catch-22, how do you train when you don't have training days? And so these officers found workarounds. They would have one person take everybody's CAT card, do the training 9 times, and then everybody got their certificate that they performed the training. This is a lie. We're saying that everybody wouldn't train when they weren't. And so when they interviewed these officers and asked them, did you lie? Did you break your own code of ethics? Did you do something without integrity? Across the board, they said no. And it's because they thought that they rationalized. They're like, you just got to do it. These are the things you need to do. Or my boss just expects it. It's the only way to get ahead. Or they also recognized that the system was a little broken, because if you admitted that you didn't do it, you got punished. But if you lied and did it, you actually made your record look better, and you actually made yourself shinier for promotion. So the whole incentive structure actually encouraged it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's catch-22. Like it's again, but they were performing unethical things, believing that they hadn't violated their own ethical code. And so what ethical fading is that. Ethical fading is when across a culture, we see unethical behavior and nobody believes they're doing anything wrong. And there's a few conditions, all of which are forms of self-deception that create ethical fading. One of them is euphemisms, the overuse of euphemisms, right? We see the overuse of euphemisms in organizations. So for example, we would never spy on our customers, but we absolutely do data mining.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We've seen it happen in our own, recently, which is the United States does not torture. Enhanced interrogation, very appealing, right? We change the words of things to make them a little more palpable for us to do, right? This is a sign that ethical fading might be there, which is the overuse of euphemisms to describe bad things or bad behaviors, because it allows us to create psychological distance, right? We don't do this, we do that, right? The other one is, as I touched on already, the rationalization. Got to put food on the table. It's the only way to get ahead. It's what my boss wants, I got to do it. I have no choice. Everybody else is doing it. It's what you got to do to get ahead, right? These are rationalizations that we tell ourselves. And so ethical fading usually comes from breakdowns in leadership. And it's not always bad or toxic. Like I said, people at the top sometimes are well-intentioned in putting out these training requirements, but usually they don't have to take the training. And so they're disconnected from the problems that it creates down at the bottom of the chain. Again, there's a breakdown in communication, right? So it's a leadership problem that creates ethical fading. If ethical fading runs rampant inside an organization, it's probably a leadership problem, because there's screwed up incentive structures, there's the pressures to do certain things at the expense of other things. And this is why the infinite game is so important, because if we're only playing the finite game, if we're only playing the short game, then the pressure to win in the short game, you might actually win in the short game. Those Wells Fargo people, they hit all their numbers, but at what cost? At what cost to the organization? And that's the problem with ethical fading. It's perfectly profitable in the short term, but it does massive damage over the long term. Yeah.
Okay, it looks like we got a few more questions for those of you.
Sorry for the long answer. You see, I was so passionate about my answer, I lost track of time.
Yeah, no, that's okay. That's great. So those of you that still joining us, we're with best-selling author Simon Sinek, and we're talking about his book, The Infinite Game. Sarah, I'll turn it over to you for the chat questions. You're on mute.
Simon, we just got a good question that came in. How do we develop or coach why thinking? We are very good at how and what in the military. I find it's extremely difficult to develop the why and inspire others to think that way.
Well, you said it. It goes to training, which is, it's much easier to train to how and what, because they're easier to measure. What is output and how are the actions you're taking? I can see how you do things and I can measure your output. And so we become overly metrics oriented, not because we're bad people, but because it's just easier. And so, starting with why and maintaining infinite mindset, it takes practice and it takes training. Unfortunately, we don't train it. We don't train it very well. For example, we in the military, we're really good at teaching leadership, and people go to leadership school and you're going to learn all kinds of techniques of leadership, but nobody ever teaches anybody how to write a vision statement. And yet every commander comes in and puts up a vision statement on the wall. Unfortunately, they keep changing every 2 years, and 99 out of 100 vision statements are crap. They're not inspiring at all. Be the preeminent supplier of X and the highest probability and fulfill our nation's mission, blah, blah, blah. And it's all true. It's just generic. It's not proprietary. It's not inspiring. And so one of the reasons we don't get why-based thinking is because we're not teaching our leaders how to talk to us from the why. I would love a class to teach commanders how to do public speaking. How to start with why. how to write a vision statement. All of these things start to have a greater impact. When you're junior, your job is to focus on the short-term finite things. That's your job. When you're senior, your job is to focus on the broad infinite things. And so language is really, really important. And so unfortunately, we don't teach it. So one of the ways we can get it is by training it.
So to add on to that, how does STRATCOM play an infinite game when all of the senior leaders, the general officers, leave every 2 years?
That's okay. That actually is not necessarily a bad thing, because at the end of the day, we're creating an enduring organization, right? How is it possible that the United States has survived for over 240 years and we get a new president every 4 to 8 years? Like, it's okay. And what makes it work is there's an enduring set of values and an enduring vision, right? The United States has a just cause. We have a vision of the world that we want to live in. It's called all men are created equal, all people are created equal. It was laid down for us a long time ago, and we have invested our lives as much as we can to try and provide life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to everybody equally as possible. Now, we'll never get there. It's an ideal, but we'll die trying. That's the point. That is the point. And you can see our nation struggling constantly to try and get there. The abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, civil rights, gay rights, all of those imperfect and ongoing in their own right. But you can see a nation striving to live to the ideals that were laid down for us 240 some odd years ago. And it's the same in the military, both big military, both at the uniform level, uniform force level, and at a COCOM level, which is there should be an enduring vision of the world that we're all committed to advance. And that enduring vision cannot be changed by a new commander, just like the Declaration of Independence cannot be changed by a president. It wouldn't work. And though you can have good leaders and bad leaders, the point is that there's something enduring that we can all latch onto, and that our values, that the values and the culture of STRATCOM will be different than the culture of another organization. Some people belong here and some people don't. Some people will thrive here and some people won't. It's okay. But the point is that there needs to be an enduring foundation, and each commander that comes in and says, I will bring that vision into the future to address whatever challenges and threats and opportunities we face today, which is all we ask of our presidents, which is take that founding vision and keep it modern. It's living and breathing, the threats change, the opportunities change, the technologies change, the politics change, the culture changes, and we have to adapt our organizations with the changing face of all those things so that we can continue to do our job the best way we can do it and advance the just cause and advance that enduring vision. And then we'll lament the loss of good commanders and be happy to see the loss of bad ones, but the organization endures with or without them. Remember, it's the players that go away, not the game.
Okay, Simon, we're coming up on the hour. Do you have some time to stay a little over, or do you have a hard break?
Sure, let's keep going. We got a bit of a late start.
Okay.
All right, I have another listener question. How does one compete against multiple competitors in an infinite game when your resources are declining? What strategy would you recommend?
Entrepreneurship. All challenges are hard challenges. I get this question, Simon, when is it a good time to start a business? In a good economy, it's much easier to get clients, but there's a ton more competition. In a bad economy, it's harder to get clients, but there's less competition. Which one's better? I don't know. It's just different. And so we have to stop thinking of things as good or bad or right or wrong. They're just different. The challenges are different. That's all, which means our solutions will be different. And so how do we stay ahead when resources are in decline? Well, sometimes having constrained resources is some of the best thinking. Go back to World War II, when resources were really constrained, where we had people on rations, and look at the innovation that came out of that period. It was unbelievable how the military going into World War II and the military coming out of World War II were completely different. It was a completely new organization because of all of the innovations that were happening under constraint. So I think very often constraint and pressure is some of the best circumstances. Mm-hmm. It's easy to throw money at problems. And if you look at small companies versus big companies, small companies that have no money, no resources, no people are some of the most innovative organizations on the planet. And large organizations with tons of money, tons of resources, tons of people suck at innovation. What large organizations do is buy small organizations. That's how they innovate. Now, there's no rule that says big makes you bad at innovation. What I think is that resource constraint makes you good at innovation. Plus, I think that small organizations tend to have visions that are bigger than the resources they have. So they have to be creative. Large organizations tend to make their visions smaller and achievable. And I think the only way to innovate is when your vision is bigger than the resources you have. So if you're a large organization, the question is your vision so big that when you come to your people and say, this is what we want to do, and everybody looks around at the money we have and go, we can't do that. Congratulations, you now have perfect conditions for innovation. So I think though it feels good to have lots of money, we're probably more creative when we have less of it.
Okay. Sarah, do you have another question?
I do. The concept of worthy rivals completely fits with continuous improvement. Simon, who do you look to as a worthy rival to spur your own improvement?
Oh, I have lists of them. I mean, what are we talking about? Are we talking about me as a human being, me as a leader? Are we talking about my business? I mean, we're constantly looking at others. In fact, we look at others in our organization, in our category all the time. Our company saying, we'll assign things. We'll like, hey, I want you to go check this out as a worthy rival. Go find out what they're doing really well so we can figure out what we can do better. We have no intention of trying to beat them. We just want to be better and better and better at what we do. Now, I freely recognize that, the job that STRATCOM does is a little different because there are consequences. Should you ever find yourselves, head to head with one of the adversaries? For me, it's not. But that doesn't mean that the tenets of the infinite games don't still apply. But there are leaders that I go to, many of whom are in the military, that I look to for inspiration and where I can improve, and plenty of organizations as well.
Okay. I've got another workplace question. So in order to correct an issue, most organizations institute what you call in your book, lazy leadership. Can you explain that concept?
So lazy leadership, that's not my term. That's actually that came from the Army. Leadership is really hard, right? And it takes a lot of courage to stand up to incumbency. It takes a lot of courage to do things differently. It takes a lot of courage when the pressures are overwhelmingly finite to try and find the way through the infinite. And lazy leadership is not, again, it's not bad people. It's just that it's easier to go with the flow. And it's certainly less stressful, and definitely in the short term. And so courage doesn't come from digging down deep inside. I believe courage is external. I've had the opportunity to meet some people who risk their lives to save the lives of others. And people on this call know many more of those people than I do. None of them were ordered to do what they did. Occasionally they disobeyed orders and did what they did. And no one would have faulted them if they didn't do what they did. And yet they did it. And many of them have families. And when I asked them, why did you do it? They all gave me the same basic answer, which is they would have done it for me. In other words, what gave them courage was the confidence that somebody would do the same for them. It wasn't necessarily digging down deep and finding the courage. It was the belief that somebody has my back that gave me the courage. We don't jump out of a plane. We don't have the courage to jump out of a plane until we know we have a parachute on our backs. The courage came from the parachute. It wasn't just this blind courage to jump out of a plane. In other words, it was something external. So the way in which we can lead effectively and lead with courage is by looking after each other. Relationships. The stronger our relationships, the more that we feel that someone has our back because we have the backs of others, the more likely we are to have the courage to do difficult things. Because sometimes it's as simple as somebody saying to us, I got your back, or you got this, or I'll do this with you, or if you go down, don't worry, I'm going with you. Like all of those little encouragements give us the courage to say and do very, very difficult things. Left to our own devices by ourselves, very, very difficult.
Okay. So I like in your book how you explained the difference between how we drive a car that we own versus one that we rent.
Yeah.
How do we get people to have that sense of ownership in our just cause?
Well, so I used the analogy. What was I referring to? I
Uh,
remember the analogy, but what was the reference?
I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I actually did have it marked in my book,
Uh,
but I
oh,
just like that
we're talking about
analogy. So,
shareholder value.
yeah.
The nonsense of shareholders who don't own the company, and yet, right. Yeah. And so the point that I made was, think about how you drive a rental car versus your own car.
Yeah.
Right?
Mhm.
Like nobody,
Mhm.
if you're a shareholder, basically you're a share renter. You know, you're renting ownership in that company for that time period, which is why we don't care about what happens to the company, because we're just renters. And so the question you're asking is, how do you have people have a sense of ownership? Make it about the people. Remember going back to the analogy I gave before, that young maintainer. You know, how do we have them have ownership over the mission or over the organization? Make it about the person to the left and person to the right. You know, make everything palpable and measurable. Make everything human and small, and that's when we start to feel ownership, because we start to really care about each other. And we got to give them the just cause. In fact, that probably comes first, which is they have to know that their work is working to advance something bigger than themselves. They have to know what the just cause is in terms that they can relate to, in inspiring terms. Goes back to that other previous question. We need to train our commanders to learn how to give a speech or start a meeting or write a vision statement that actually is inspiring and compelling, rather than, you know, insert name of command here, generic, accurate, just not inspiring. So I think there's giving people a sense of just cause that's in terms that are clear and specific and ideological, and they can relate to, and then building those trusting teams around them. They'll take ownership.
Okay. Sarah, did you have another question in the queue?
I do. All right, so Simon, we've had a stunning advancement of technology, policy changes, and working practices because of COVID-19. How do you recommend that we prevent the regression of them, because we fear that people will want to return to a normal that's just not going to exist anymore?
Well, some of it will return. You know, the question is how do we keep the best stuff? You know, just, you know, I've heard people saying, you know, people will never go back to offices anymore because companies will realize how much money they can save because people can work effectively from home. Sure, except we want to be around people, except we're social animals, except we feel disconnected when we're offline and we want to feel connected. So, but now we have a capability that maybe people can work once a week from home, where they can be at home with their families and still be effective members of the team once a week. But it's not a question of the pendulum was here and now it's going to go here. The question is, what's the right place for the pendulum to settle? And I think, again, we have to get away from questions get away from thinking of things as good or bad or right or wrong, and rather thinking, what's the capability that we can leverage from now on? How can we leverage this and continue to use this? I think is how we have to frame these things. And then I think the best stuff will last.
You have another? Okay,
I do.
go ahead.
How would you suggest we embrace the competition, embrace the game and arena, not just to win, but to maintain a winning mindset and embrace the relationships of people and organizations that join us with the same goals and values?
That's a loaded question. A lot of the so let me take a sideways answer, right? Which is, when we can agree on cause, it's amazing how much stuff falls away. So let's use the concept of human life, joint, this idea of joint, right? Everybody knows that in a combat situation, joint works great, you know, and the specific uniform that someone's wearing and all that silliness, that the bickering, it goes away because human life is at stake, and it works really, really well in combat. It's back at home station, it's back at Pentagon, where joint is a mess and political and fighty and bickery, right? It's because the stakes are about money. They're not about human life now. And so the more we can keep it focused on vision and something human, the better people are at working together. So here's another example that I'll give sort of a sideways in. You look at politics, and we now exist in a world in which the both sides of the aisle think that they're right and the other side is wrong, right? There's no such thing as nuance or gray. It's gone, right? This is the world we live in. But the reality is the only difference between the political parties is at the strategy level, not at the vision level. Anyone who gets elected to any kind of office believes in the Declaration of Independence and swears an oath to the Constitution, right? We all believe that all men are created equal, endowed with unalienable rights, amongst which include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The debate is how we're going to get there and how we're going to provide that. And one of the things we've forgotten to do is remind ourselves why we got into this game in the first place, why we joined the force in the first place. Regardless of what uniform you're in, everybody took the same oath and wears the same flag on their shoulder. And we've forgotten to remind people that we're actually on the same team. And same goes with the different command structures, which is it becomes very tribal and territorial. But the reality is we can do better at reminding people that we're on the same team. And when you can get it to that higher level, like think when a hurricane comes through when a hurricane comes storming through a city, right? Nobody cares about economics or race or gender identity or sexuality or politics. Like nobody cares. Like we rush to each other's aid. And that's the thing that I love about human beings, that when push comes to shove, we're actually will take care of each other. But I hate the idea that we have to wait for crisis or tragedy for people to come together. So the question is how can we keep that cause alive and work hard to create strong leadership environments in which we're able to create and foster those personal relationships so that we have that sense of cooperation. For me, at the risk of sounding like, a hammer that every problem's a nail, I think it's leadership. I think good leadership is able to create this environment without the storm.
Okay.
Can I just say, just as a point of reference, the military asks me the most difficult questions every time. I've been asked none of these questions ever before in my career, and they're really hard. And whereas when I do private sector stuff, I've been asked like 80% of the questions 100 times, and the questions are like, got this one,
Yeah.
So I'm enjoying this. You're making my head hurt, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, and our command's very unique. We got a lot of big thinkers and stuff. So we're about 10 minutes after, so we could wrap things up. I just want to turn it over to you to make some final thoughts. What do you want to leave with us? Just from your heart, what do you want to share with us?
One of the things that everybody on this call probably knows is how that when you're in combat and you're in mission mode and you're in go mode, there's no such thing as compartmentalizing emotions. You're just delaying when you're going to deal with the trauma. And everybody here knows that, and that sometimes the difficult happens when you come home, months after somebody comes home from a combat situation. And remember, COVID is a crisis. And we are all suffering trauma right now. And many of us are in go mode and in mission mode and really focused and head down. And I just want to remind everybody that we have to deal with this stuff. And if we're in go mode and enjoying ourselves and sort of, that it's going to come at some point when things slow down and go back to normal. So just to remind your friends and family that I've been in go mode the whole time. Please be patient with me when this is done. And just being aware of it helps. And make sure that if you see somebody who's struggling, please go up to them and put your hand on their shoulder and say, I gotcha. Don't let anybody cry alone. This is a difficult time. Let's not put too fine a point on it, and you guys, more than most sectors in America, are in go mode and in mission mode through this. So I want to really underline and reinforce, take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Even if things feel good, just be prepared that we're all going to need a lot of support when we come out of this.
Yeah, totally agree. Thank you so much, Simon, just for just taking the time to talk with us. It was very insightful, very informative. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of conversations after this. So thank you once again. For everybody out there, stay safe. Simon, stay safe, and your family stay safe. And thanks everybody for tuning in. Just as a reminder, we're going to have this recorded, so we'll have it posted on the Strat web as soon as we do some production work on it. But once again, Simon, thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. It's a real honor.
All right. Thank you.